Um, well, I guess I wanted to start at the start, in a way, with the first chapter or a couple chapters, and I was thinking on the way down here about this Russell Banks kind of quotable line that I always thought seemed really right, but have had occasion to question it since. And he sort of essentially said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that if a short story is like an apartment, there's really only one way in, right? You know, there's only really one way to begin a short story that will work for the short story formally. Then a novel is like a mansion, right? It's more sprawling, and his line that I remember is that you just get in wherever you can.
Mm-hmm.
And that seemed like an interesting idea to me, but since I've wondered if that's true or not, because I think that when we read novels, you know, we often read the first 50 pages and decide whether we're going to take this trip or not, right? And something I so admire about 10,000 Saints is that the first 50 pages or so are completely grabbing, and the incident that happens, I think, like 25 pages in or so, when Jude's friend Teddy and Johnny's little brother dies of various substances.
Spoiler alert.
Not too much of a spoiler, I hope. But in the process, just before he dies, ends up impregnating one of the other main characters. And that resonates throughout the novel and gives the novel its shape. And I'm thinking that that's such a vivid event and is so central to the book. And I think, no, that is the only way in, right? That is the only way into this book. And so I guess my question to you is, at what point did that come along? Was that there right away?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've often heard novelists say, you know, I write the first chapter last, which is an interesting idea. And so I guess I'm wondering, at what point did you know that this action must come first and set the pattern for the rest of the book?
Yeah. Well, the first chapter or two, there are now 2 opening chapters that take place on the first night on New Year's Eve, 1987. Those were sort of always the opening pages. You know, I knew that I wanted to introduce, you know, readers to the characters and the setting. Remember Christopher Tillman, who was our workshop leader, faculty member at University of Virginia, and I was, you know, workshopping the opening of this novel with him, said, you know, your only obligation in the first chapter is to introduce your readers to the world and to the characters. And so I thought, oh, okay, that's what I'm doing. I can do that. And so I, you know, sort of took my time introducing various cast of characters, maybe too large a cast of characters. During those first couple of chapters, it was actually a prologue for many drafts and many years. I called it a prologue, in part because it felt like the action that was going to then resonate throughout the rest of the book. I feel like Sean McConnell in the audience told me that might be a bad idea. Am I misremembering that? Some of them, you know, I've shared lots of drafts with lots of readers in grad school and beyond, and didn't feel like a prologue, and that it was very long. And so I cut it down quite a bit and turned one chapter into 2. So that night was sort of always that night, and it felt like whatever was going to happen that night was going to be fairly momentous. But I'm sort of embarrassed to say that the actual action didn't come to me until second draft of the book. So in the first draft, if I can remember back to 15 years ago when I started the book. So Eliza doesn't get pregnant until later in the book in the first draft. Teddy sort of messes around with some girl who's not Eliza in the first draft. And it wasn't until writing that first draft where I realized, oh, this is sort of what has to happen in order for these 3 people to sort of conspire to keep this secret, and the way that this baby matters is it's Teddy's child. So it's sort of like embarrassing to admit that, like, I didn't have that control and didn't have that foresight, but I think it's also somewhat freeing for a writer to realize, like, you don't have to have all the answers in the first draft, and I had to write my way through, like, that mansion and wander around in the dark, bumping into furniture and sort of feeling my way through what the chapters might be before I would realize what was important. and sort of tighten those relationships so they became much more significant and impactful.
Sort of bring this string together.
Yeah.
How long was that first strand?
540 pages, I'm so sorry to say. Yeah. Yeah, it was big, and it was all in the first, it wasn't in the first person, it was in the third person, but it might as well have been in the first person. It was so close to Jude's own experience. So Jude is this 16-year-old boy who, you know, like a lot of 16-year-old boys, isn't the most articulate young man. And so I felt a little claustrophobic by the end of those 540 pages, just hearing Jude sort of, you know, talk us through that world. And so as I was figuring out what actually had to happen in the story in a productive way, I also knew that I wanted to introduce other characters' perspectives. And so broke the book open in such a way that there are now like 6 or 8 major points of view, and Jude's is just the central one.
Yeah, and a few characters we flash into briefly.
Yeah.
Interesting. So I guess that leads into my second question. That at the point where you decide that you're going to do more of a third omniscient kind of polytonal approach, that definitely increases the technical complexity, right?
Yeah.
And probably ups the challenge quite a bit as well. So I guess 2 questions about that. Were you outlining throughout this process? If you can maybe share your outlining process if you're one of those people who puts things on the wall or with a whiteboard or whatever. Yeah. And then I'm wondering, because what's really cool about the book and really interesting is that I feel like you often choose a character who's just a little sort of you know, is deeply involved in the dramatic moment, I suppose, but is also just a little to the side of it sometimes, and is commenting on it, and often providing very, you know, actually practically useful information to the reader. And so I'm wondering how you thought about the changes in perspective, operating on that level.
Yeah, so I guess 2 answers. I mean, in terms of my outlining process, I tend to be an over-planner, and I've just sort of come to expect that the plan will sort of disintegrate and will change in some way, and that's okay, and that's part of the process. But so I had, you know, from the beginning, I had a 1-page outline. For me, it's important to sort of have everything on 1 page so I can see it, you know, printed out above my computer. If it's longer than a page, it's not that helpful, right? Because then we're just describing like what's happening on a minute level. So that was helpful to me, and it was much more ambitious, you know, and sort of impossible than I could have sustained. But so I revised that 1-page outline just to sort of remind myself what that action was and whose point of view we're in and where we are, et cetera. So it's helpful to me to have sort of a map, as long as I know that the map can change. I mean, I'm not a writer who can go in entirely blindly. I mean, I already had enough trouble sort of finding my way through with some idea of where I thought I wanted to go. But then in terms of like how and when to navigate the point of view shifts, I mean, I actually felt like it was quite freeing to be able to tell the story from more than one point of view, right? Because it can be so limiting, you know, to feel like the camera has to be on one character's shoulder the whole time. And I think especially with a story about, in part, the straight edge scene, which is so black and white, and it was interpreted from the 16-year-old boy's point of view, and so he, you know, had a very sort of righteous interpretation of the way that people should behave, and that was not very interesting to me as a writer after a while. And so I wanted to show, you know, more nuance, and so I found that I could kind of become more comfortable with the material and feel like I could reflect it more accurately when I would introduce, for example, his mother Harriet's point of view, who had a more complicated relationship to it, who is, you know, proud and relieved that her son was getting off drugs, but also was like really skeptical about some of the moral righteousness of the scene, and like was kind of freaked out by the music, and so also as I began to introduce those other points of view, which helped me to understand the material, I kind of realized like I'm not just writing a coming of age story about this boy who's moving through the straight edge scene and moving through the grief of his best friend's death. It, you know, also became kind of a coming of age story about the family and the city.
Yeah, and one of the real pleasures of the book is seeing how it becomes more generational. As we were saying last night, that Jude's and Johnny's sort of quest is in a way away from his parents' lifestyle, and that makes it a more broadly explorative book. Maybe we can just back up a little bit and maybe talk about before all these technical concerns became an issue, because one of the themes of this series is the theme, sorry, is truth and proximity. Some terms we left vague enough to apply really broadly, but you mentioned last night that some of the book, or perhaps the genesis of the book, was based on Aaron, your husband's experience, but also along the way you also had to do quite a bit of it seems like book research as well, right? Maybe newspaper research. And so, I'm wondering, in that process, there must have been kind of many moments where you're trying to do two things, right? You're trying to sort of stay true to what, perhaps you've learned from Aaron, but also you have to be true to like the broader community of people who might have been affected by it. Yeah. And so I'm wondering about that journey as well, because it is funny when you do base something on someone's experience close to you, you do feel a certain responsibility to them, but you also have to, tell the best story you can as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so my husband Aaron was the biggest asset in my research, for sure. Was really forthcoming with sharing all the memories that he had of that time and place. But he also gets sort of irritated when his friends will ask him, like, "Who are you in the book?" Because it's really not, it's not about him. It's not about his experience. He didn't have a best friend who died. He didn't go live with his pot dealer dad. It really was based on the world that he lived in, and I accessed that world through his memories and definitely through a sort of veil of nostalgia. So, I could ask him, like, what band would have split a 7-inch with We Get Through Today in 1987?
Right.
And he could tell me.
Yeah, nice.
And he was very helpful with that kind of stuff. But, certainly I'd sort of, borrowed some of his, youthful exuberance from that period. He was still straight edge when I met him, and so I, went to a number of straight edge shows with him in Vermont. And so I felt like I was sort of close enough to the scene, brushing up against it to feel like I had some understanding of the way that it functioned and the way that it looked. But also, I was writing about a period that was 1988 started the book, more than 10 years after that. So I sort of had to capture an era too that was sort of gone, and traditional research came into play with that too. So I did feel, in a way protective of his experience, but because I wasn't really personalizing it in a way, that wasn't the biggest challenge. More of the challenge was, as I was talking about a bit last night, just sort of getting the scene right, getting New York right, getting the time right, because these were all things that I was approaching as an outsider. And I find that that's the way that I am most comfortable approaching fiction, as kind of an outsider, with a little bit of objectivity, but obsessive interest at the same time. Who has a question?
But as an outsider,
yeah,
especially since you just said that you met your husband and he was still straight edge.
Yeah.
I don't know, at that time, how much you knew of the culture, but
yeah.
Is there a singular aspect or image that made you want to write an entire novel? And it would be your first novel. So I guess for a lot of people that's a commitment.
Yeah.
First novel,
yeah.
What your topic is.
Right.
Was there a singular thing that made it interesting to you?
I don't think there was one singular thing. I'm trying to remember back to the first seeds. I do remember going to this show at a club called 242 in Burlington, Vermont, one of my first shows there, and just coming back and blowing my nose with black snot after the show and going this, and this was something that everyone was totally accustomed to, right? You just go home, you're looking at me really strangely. But it was just a thing that happened. There was so much sweat and funk. I actually don't know physically how this happens.
Right.
Someone else can speak to this. But it was just so filthy, and like there's so much like body contact. There's black snot that happens after every show, and everyone was sort of like, yeah, this is sort of like part of the experience, that like real intense intimacy that happens in a scene. So I was like, this is totally obscene and like really interesting, and just the intensity of those shows certainly was like something I wanted to try to capture. Mm-hmm. And then, also I remember reading early on in my research an interview with someone who had been involved in the scene just sort of as a traveling sort of fan, and this person was speaking to the sort of atmosphere he woke up into on one morning after crashing with a band, and how he was expected to perform sexual acts with the person who had let them stay at his house. Huh. And I was like, oh, like, yeah, that totally could be happening behind the scenes. And so what are like sort of the unspoken tensions in a scene that's so male dominated, and it's about, in some ways, like rejecting girls, rejecting sex. What are the sort of homoerotic tendencies of some of the characters? So that was sort of invented, but also made me realize like there are some layers underneath what I could already tell were some really interesting tensions in the scene. I mean, it's all a paradox, right? I mean, it's just a scene about kids who are saying no to drugs, but they're 16, 17-year-old kids who are being powered by testosterone, and like that energy's got to go somewhere, and they're totally involved in this really angry hardcore punk music, but they're like living these like choir boy lives. So I knew there was like a story to sort of navigate there. And then the last thing that I'll say sort of as a sideways answer to that is I remember I started writing this book on the subway when I was commuting to all these different jobs in New York City after college. And I kind of knew that I wanted to tell a story about an adopted kid. And I think it's like Stephen King who says, as many people do, Grace Paley also does, that a story often comes when you marry two seemingly incompatible ideas together. So I think thinking about the straight edge scene and how interested I was in all of its paradoxes, and then also thinking about writing a story about an adopted kid, because my older brother was adopted, and it was sort of a story that was unspoken in our house. It made a lot of sense that a kid who was adopted, who sort of felt like he was adopted into the wrong family, would really have a strong desire to belong in a scene like this one. And so so that was one way I sort of realized, okay, this is going to be my territory.
A really fussy technical question, but something I'm interested in. And the book definitely takes pains, not, pains is the wrong word, but it's very faithful, it seems, to Tompkins Square in New York in the late 80s, and it gets those details, I assume very right, I don't know, but it feels very right to me. And the other pole of the book is Vermont, and it set in Lindenburg, which is your creation, right? So I'm just interested in that funny thing. You're very historically accurate to New York, but you kind of invented what's more or less Burlington, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering about that decision.
Yeah, not really a fussy question, I think. I mean, that was a pretty crucial decision, at least it felt like to me. Because in early drafts of the book, the first part of the book, the Lindenburg sections are set in Burlington. And, I have a lot of love for Burlington and felt like I knew Burlington fairly well, have some familial connections to the city. And so in early workshops, I was writing about Burlington and also writing about New York. And the shift in my thinking about that came in a workshop at the University of Virginia, where one of the people in my workshop of like 8 happened to grow up in Burlington, Vermont, and was the exact same age as Jude and had gone to the same venues. And one of the bands, Screaming Broccoli, I think it's called, which was like a real band. I had researched, I've got to have a real Vermont punk band in this book. She was like roommates with him, in the late 80s. And so then I was like, wait, this is a really tiny little world I'm trying to penetrate and capture here. Is that really what my job is? Because I was basically fictionalizing the transfer of the straight edge scene to Burlington
Right.
in the late 80s, and it didn't go like that, right? Like there's probably a handful of characters who were involved in that story, and Jude was not one of them. So that felt kind of wrong and weird and not really what my ultimate objective was. She would say things on the manuscript like, well, they don't actually have school buses in Burlington. Do you want me to tell you that stuff? And I was like, what am I doing trying to bend over backwards, get this stuff right? What's really important is that I'm getting the New York scene right, because that was really the sort of momentous historical occasion as far as New York hardcore history went, and that was not something I could entirely fictionalize. But I could introduce this band, Army of One, and it could kind of fit in without much sort of disruption of that real history. And I wasn't going to make New York City like Gotham or something. Like it had to be New York City.
Yeah, sure.
I was actually at Breadloaf studying with Lan Samantha Chang, and I was kind of telling her about this problem I was having, and she was like, "Why don't you just fictionalize it?" It's like, oh, that's great. And so then I came up with Lintonburg, which is an anagram for Burlington, and then I got to experience a little bit more.
So it is an anagram.
Yeah, have you seen that?
Yeah.
Very clever, I think. And then I had a little bit more freedom to explore, and it could just be like any town. I think it's what's his face, Richard, the guy who wrote Clockers.
Richard Price.
Yeah, Richard Price, who has this sort of like fictional town in New Jersey, and he says it doesn't matter what that town is. The point is that it's not New York. It's in the sort of shadow of New York City, and so I felt like that was true of Lintonburg as well. Was what it wasn't was more important.
Yeah, interesting. Well, is it now a good time to open up to general questions? Or?
Sounds good.
So, kind of taking what Will's starting question was about access to short stories that you can have an entry through. It's a pretty linear path through it versus a novel. I'm bringing that into workshop, and now that you're like teaching, there's a famous story that the Art Institute getting her master's or construction that she's painting like that contact with this society painting over nobody knows what that guy is. So I guess I'm just curious, like having gone through the workshop, because I remember you bringing this novel and it was such a different experience that I think from other people who might have just been trained or maybe you haven't, right?
Yeah.
And so like going through that process and have you transitioned to teaching, or there's some things you learned having gone through the workshop process with people who've been in story versus the novel, how do you kind of shape your instruction with those students, and how you were affected by it?
Yeah. Well, so I did have in mind that I was going to work on this novel at UVA. I'd started it like a year or two before. I took off 2 years between college and grad school and was working on it. And I sort of thought that's what you did in grad school. You work on a novel, because that's what grown-up writers do. And so I had in my mind that that's what I was going to do, and I'd started at chapter 2. And then I got there, and the first day of workshop, our professor, Christopher Tillman, said, I really hope none of you is planning to work on a novel. Jesus, sort of, yeah. And so he just sort of raised his eyebrows and said, okay, we'll see how it goes. It ended up working really well in that I worked with Christopher Tillman consecutively for my first 2 semesters there and was able to produce, 100 pages or something with him, and he was really supportive of it and came around to the idea that this was a project that I should be working on. And it was incredibly helpful to me in the sense I still teach to this day the chart that he created for that class, which I don't think he would have if I hadn't been working on this damn novel, which is the way that the short story works versus the way the novel works in terms of it's very cool. I'll send it to you. Well, gosh, I wish I brought it. So the short story works on vertical action, and the novel works on horizontal action. Short story is about the destination. The novel's about a journey. Short story is sex. Novel is marriage. It's like the apartment versus mansion. And like a lot of them, like my students go, I'm not quite sure about that, but it's a really nice place to start a conversation about what a short story can do and what a novel can do. So I teach a lot of fiction 1 and fiction 2 at Ithaca College, first being with a focus on the short story, and the second, my students can start working on longer pieces, and I also teach writing a short novel there. So, and my students like to work on longer pieces, I think more than when I was an undergrad and even grad student. And there's a reason why a short story is sort of the currency of the workshop. But these are kids who are coming with a desire to write, not just one novel, but a series of 5. So, I think having had that background of working on the novel in college was in grad school was helpful, but it did become logistically difficult, right? Like after the first 300 pages, when you're like get into the next semester's workshop and you're asking your workshop mates to read 300 pages by Monday, you start losing friends pretty quickly. So I don't recommend that necessarily, but I do like sort of have some jealousy of these larger MFA programs that have classes just on the novel, where you sort of, it's part of the contract. If you're going to be signing up, you're going to be doing some pretty heavy reading. So it'd be nice to have that. Yeah.
So you said you worked on this novel for 15 years.
I started it 15 years ago.
Okay.
14 years ago. Yeah, but I worked on it for about 9 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in any case, I guess like you brought up that when you were starting out, you had these experiences of like going to shows and stuff like that. And I'm just wondering, like, what is the experience like of sustaining something, like as you get further in your own life experiences from like the life experiences of your protagonist?
Yeah.
As your prose develops, like how do you kind of continue to like
Yeah.
ground yourself in that, like even though you're
Right.
changing as a person?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when I started the book, I was like 22, and so I definitely identified pretty closely with this teenager who was coming of age, having like just come of age recently myself. And by the time I was done, I was closer to the parents' age and was a parent myself, and so totally identified with this mother who was, just trying to do the best by her son. So, I think the book grew in that way. I'm glad that I took a long time to write it and that I couldn't have had maybe that level of empathy with the parents' generation that I could have had if I'd written it in a year and published it. I think it would have been a narrower book. So, even though I hope that I don't take 9 years to write every book, and I don't really wish that on anybody, I'm glad it'd be my first novel. I had to teach myself how to write it. So I went through lots and lots of drafts, and I sort of couldn't have done it any other way, I think. There aren't really those kinds of shortcuts. And even though I put the novel away many times through many drafts, I think it was sort of marinating. It wasn't just dead, wasted time. It was sort of growing while I was growing as a person.
And Jude grows up over the course of the book, it should be said, too.
Yeah,
So,
Jude grows up quite a bit.
Yeah. Another question I had is that, Jude's a little shit in the first couple chapters of the book, and but he comes pretty soulful by the end.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if he was always a little shit in the first couple chapters, or you went back and shitted him up a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, because do you want a main character? Everyone's like that brat, right? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, he's pretty bratty. I mean, he does sort of a little ungrateful bastard in a certain way in the first part of the book, and he just is interested in, getting high and quitting school, and so I think the turning point definitely is losing his friend, right? Sort of ages anybody, forces him to grow up in a certain way, and then also having the opportunity to meet and reconnect with his dad, and he has lots of role models, none of them very good, but sort of assembled together, they sort of give him some options for thinking about what he wants his life to look like. He's pretty much always a sort of a troublemaker from the beginning. I mean, I guess I was actually a little bit confused about who the troublemaker was going to be, actually, whether it was going to be Teddy or Jude for a while. So there was, in later drafts, there was still a little bit of ambiguity, I think, about their characters, and I had a lot of readers who were confused about who was who. So, one way to kind of distinguish them, was Teddy became more of a passive character, and Jude became more of an active one.
Mm-hmm.
Which was important for me to have a character who was actively engaging with the story and making choices,
happen.
even if they were bad ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Kelly.
I'm interested to hear about how the movie came about. Did you write the screenplay, or did you have a role in writing the screenplay? What about casting and all of that?
Yeah. I had very little creative control, and right now I'm really grateful for that, but it was a little scary. Mostly I was just so excited by the prospect of this book being turned into a movie that I just sort of, signed away my life. Yes, please. You know, there were a few conversations with different movie makers, and eventually the folks who optioned it were Sherry Springer Berman and Robert Pulcini, who are a screenwriter-director couple. They did American Splendor as the movie they're best known for. And you know, I allowed them to develop the screenplay and really had no involvement in that at all. I did have a nice lunch with them where we sort of brainstormed about, wouldn't it be great if Ethan Hawke played Les, and that kind of stuff. And then I sort of didn't hear anything from them for like a year. And I sort of like tried to forget that that was a possibility, and I know that these things don't work out very often. But then they wrote the screenplay and got Ethan Hawke attached to it, and then it came together very quickly after that point. And so once I found out on Twitter one day, someone tweeted at me, "Oh, look, Haley Steinfeld is set to star in 10,000 Saints." I'm like, what? I didn't hear anything about this. And then got, you know, an email from my agent 5 minutes later. So it came together really quickly, and right before they started shooting, I emailed the producer and went, "Can I look at the screenplay maybe?" And it was sent to me, and I kind of read it like this, a little bit terrified of how much they were going to butcher it. But I had pretty high expectations, knowing the screenwriters and admiring their work. And it was really an amazing experience to read the screenplay, because they had made so many really keen, artful choices about what to leave out. Like, for example, Delph and Cram, the two sidekick buddies, aren't in the movie at all. Even the sort of subplot of Tori and Hippie, the guys who sort of send Jude out of Vermont, the sort of antagonists, they were actually shot on set, and I met them, and they're really nice guys, but they totally got cut out of the movie.
Oh, wow.
And it's a better movie for it. So there's a lot that's left out, and they're really the right choices, and I know that I couldn't have made those choices myself, you know, because I would have tried to do everything that the novel could do. And so really it's quite streamlined, and it focuses maybe a little bit less on the straight edge scene and a little bit more on the family, which I think is a good choice. It's really a family drama, and it's a story about New York. And you know, I got to be on set quite a bit, which was fun, but I really had no part in it at all. One time a producer came up to me and asked me, we were shooting the hospital scene, what would Eliza's birthday be? Because we need to go make her a bracelet, you know, when her child is born in the hospital. So I got to help by producing some information that felt useful. That was totally unuseful. You know, I just sat back and watched, and it was pretty wild. You know, like all these people are on set doing their job, and I was just in the background, like sobbing as they're filming. I wrote all these words that I wrote down a long time ago. So I was having this like transcendent emotional experience, and everyone's like quiet on set. Yeah.
Do they keep? Well, especially Les's dialogue is so great. Did they keep any
they
of
kept
that?
a lot of the
Yeah,
dialogue.
that's cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they kept a lot of the dialogue, and it goes over really well, I think. Yeah. The movie is a dilapidated house on 14th Street with a pot closet in it. Yeah, I don't know. I like the house metaphor. I have to think about it. Yeah, I guess a condo because it's that vertical space, right? Well, no, I mean, it's definitely compressed. It's definitely a compressed experience. We're talking about how poetry is like more like screenplay is more like poetry than like fiction. Yeah, I mean, definitely had a poetic sensibility to the screenplay. Yeah.
Did you write the novel with that? I've always been curious how writers wrote fiction or movies, the bigger medium. And I'm curious, not that if you were writing a novel with hopes that it would become a movie, but how much of the cinematic perspective did you kind of inherently have while you were writing it?
I think I had a pretty strongly cinematic perspective. I like movies a lot, and I think it's sort of hard to unknow movies, as you seem to be saying, like when you're writing fiction. So I did sort of see it like a movie. I mean, of course, I had these like, you know, grand fantasies about it becoming a movie, but never thought that would actually happen. But I did, and I think the book is fairly cinematic, and in that, you know, pretty vivid, and the setting is pretty strong, you know, character in the book. And I did sort of start writing it. I didn't start writing it as a screenplay. I had maybe a draft of the book, and then when I started revising it, I wrote it as a screenplay for a short time, just to help me visualize it a little bit, and I didn't really know what I was doing. But actually, the opening of the movie is so close to what I had imagined in that screenplay. It's pretty incredible. So, yeah, I mean, I think, I teach this class on adaptation by coincidence at Ithaca College called Short Stories on the Screen. So I think, I've been thinking a lot myself in teaching that class about what makes a text inherently adaptable, and also, what the writer's role is ideally in that experience. And so I think I was well prepared for that experience, having been through that class. You and then you. You're good.
I guess kind of going off that, do you think that punk rock as a musical form had any influence on your writing style? Either pacing or the sort of prose?
Yeah, I don't actually, and I sort of wondered if maybe it should, if there's such a thing as a punk rock novel, what that looks like or sounds like. I mean, there are others we could talk about, right? And I didn't really realize that I was kind of intentionally working against that. I read a review by Nick Hornby in The Believer of the book, in which he says something like he was so pleasantly surprised that the material of the music couldn't be more divorced from the sentences themselves, and that is creates some of the tension. That it's not a book that seeks to represent what punk feels like. They're pretty vivid descriptions or in-depth descriptions of the shows, but it's not about trying to replicate, I think, what punk can do. I think that sensibility comes across in other ways, not in the sentences themselves, if that makes sense. Yeah. You had a question back there.
Yeah, I was wondering, with your research, if you researched a lot of alternatives with recovery for, drug use or use, etc. And if you had ever heard of a recovery where people just totally abuse each other.
Oh, no, I don't know about that. I mean, I did research to the degree that I wanted to know what rehab looked like or what the options were in 1988 for, a kid who was in bad shape. My mother-in-law used to live on St. Mark's Place, right next to what was a big rehab clinic that appears in the scene that I read last night. No smoking, no pot smoking, no drinking, stairs. So, the rehab did not have the same sort of shiny quality that it has today. And, I think that's probably what, in some ways, kind of gave birth to the straight edge scene, that was the kind of rehab that these kids invented for themselves.
Was that rehab sort of where they're kind of hard on each other to the point of verbally abusing each other?
The kids in straight edge scene? I mean, I think there's a lot of aggression in the music. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of aggression toward anybody who didn't sort of buy into the culture of no drugs, no exceptions. So it's interesting that might be an aspect of recovery, but oh no, it's new to me. Maybe that'll be the next book.
Right. Questions? Other questions? How are we doing on time? 10 minutes? Sure. Well, actually, your question about the punk rock question is pretty interesting. The chapter you read last night, I mentioned to you earlier, one thing I really like about it a lot is that and about the book generally, is that we're not just getting characters meeting or reuniting or characters being introduced to us, but they're often doing something. So last night when, with the chapter you read, Jude and Johnny are reunited, or at least Jude hasn't seen Johnny in a hell of a long time and doesn't really know him, but they're intimately connected to Teddy. And when they re-meet, they're immediately doing something. They're playing laser tag on the train, so that the complexity of the emotions of them meeting is sort of expressed also through this competition they have, the rush of being in this place, of being underground, of shuttling around, or on a just sort of a more on a quieter level. There's a scene where Les, the father, is on the phone and he's being told something very important, but he's trying to watch the Yankees game at the same time.
Right.
And I love that the book has many of those moments. So anyway, you said that you weren't necessarily conscious of that or did it intuitively. So I guess maybe another way for me to express this question is that one other element of the book is that the characters are very intimately intertwined and have a lot of the relationships like branch out in many different directions. And so I'm wondering about keeping track of that as well, right? It's not something that you can as easily outline, right? That's something that is a little bit more nuanced and intrinsic that you can't really pattern.
I mean, it does feel a little absurd anytime I try to set up the book and when I'm reading from like a chapter, you know, because I feel like I need to draw like a family tree for people in the audience because it's so complicated. But you know, I mean, life is complicated. So yeah, I mean, it felt a little bit, you know, there's some sort of soap opera dimensions of that. Like, you know, I was raised on General Hospital. I'm not ashamed to say. But yeah, I mean, I'm sort of a visual person, so I'm sort of surprised I didn't have like some elaborate map above my desk. But I think like, you know, when you spend that much time with a character, and with those characters, they sort of become, those relationships become, you know, like members of your family. So, I mean, one thing that I do a lot of is just sort of note-taking and sort of pre-writing. So, you know, notebooks and notebooks full of just thinking through those relationships myself, right? And I never go back to those notebooks, but they're just ways that I sort of have gotten to know the characters and the ways that they're intertwined and who has met whom at what point and that kind of thing. And then in terms of like the action and the story, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it as being like a very active book, but I guess you're right. And I don't know if that has to do with the characters being teenage boys and having a lot of energy and they're always on skateboards or they're playing laser tag or whatever. The laser tag scene did not entirely make it into the movie, which is probably my biggest point of heartbreak. They do have laser tag, but they're playing it like in an empty lot and it's like a little montage, so it's enough. Yeah, I know. I mean, it was really impossible. They do have a good subway scene, but it's not. There's no guns on it. Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about Victor Laval, who visited Ithaca College last semester, and he had students do what he calls plot boxes to remind them that action, you know, should always be taking place, because you know, I think literary writers tend to do a lot of sitting around and thinking. You know, their characters tend to do a lot of sitting around and thinking, and so characters definitely do a lot of reflecting, but I think it's more productive when they're walking down the street doing it, because, you know, you always have to be conscious, I think, of doing more than one thing at once. Every page has got to be multitasking.
And I guess the reason that your question about punk rock aesthetic, because it seems to me that even though these characters live in this, you know, clipped, aggressive, angry world, the novel is almost more Victorian in its plan and its scope and its ambition. And so I guess I'm just, you know, just a sort of generic question about what you might have been reading all along. Yeah.
I like thinking about it that way. One book that had a big impact on me the time I started writing the book was Michael Chabon's Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, you know, which captured that testosterone and that energy and that exuberance of a particular period. You know, it's like the most exuberant historical novel I think I've ever written. There's so much energy, and you know, it was about these boys who were just nobodies, but you know, they created a culture. And so I thought, I want to do that on some level. I thought I wanted to do that. And so that was a book that was dear to me. And then also Jonathan Letham's The Fortress of Solitude had a big impact on me, you know, sort of for the same reasons. You know, I was very interested in that time in sort of boy culture and the way that it manifested in a pocket of New York. And you know, the sort of gritty level of detail that those writers were interested in, but they also were doing something bigger. You know, they also were doing something I think more ambitious in terms of scope, and so those books were inspiring to me.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Do you know about the soundtrack for the movie?
Oh yeah, so this was a question at the Sundance premiere, and the answer was we don't know yet. Apparently, that's my question. I want to know. Yeah. Well, I can tell you who's on it, is that what you're asking? I don't know if it's going to be a soundtrack that's out in the world, but I really love the soundtrack. There's my favorite montage is the Fall on Me REM montage. It's really appropriate. There's some Stone Roses at the end. There's some replacements. You know, I really like the way the directors have sort of infused their version of 80s New York on the book, and it's not, you know, as I hoped, it's not just a hardcore soundtrack. Like there are some staples, you know, Straight Edge is on there. Emil Hirsch and some of the other guys in the band, you know, they wrote some songs for them to sing. So there's, you know, some of my lyrics from the book become a song.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Positive aggression. Let's fuck this place up with some positive aggression. So that's my songwriting claim to fame, I guess. Yeah, I hope it'll be available. Be fun.
If anyone just has one last question.
Thanks for your questions, guys.
Thanks, Eleanor. Thanks for everyone, and round of applause for Eleanor.
Thank you.